Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The children noticed him first, though none of them could say exactly when he began appearing. It was early morning when the groundskeeper found them clustered near the eastern wall of the courtyard, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on something only they seemed to understand. When he asked what they were staring at, the oldest girl simply pointed to the empty space between the mango trees and whispered that the boy without a shadow had been there again. The groundskeeper felt the hairs on his arms rise, though he saw nothing but morning light filtering through the leaves. He told them to go inside for breakfast, but as he turned to leave, he noticed something that made his throat tighten. The dirt where the children had been pointing was disturbed, marked by small footprints that led nowhere, starting in the middle of the courtyard and ending abruptly at the base of the tree. The Battambang Orphanage had stood on the same plot of land for nearly 40 years, built in the aftermath of war, when the need for such places was overwhelming. It was a modest compound, 3 long buildings arranged around a central courtyard where the children played during their limited free time. The walls were painted a faded yellow that had once been bright, and the roof tiles were mismatched from decades of repairs. Sister Mally had run the orphanage for the past 12 years, taking over from the previous director who had died quietly in her sleep. She was a stern woman, but not unkind, and the children respected her in the way that orphans learn to respect the adults who control their world. There were 32 children living there when the sightings began, ranging in age from 4 to 15. Most had lost their parents to illness or poverty, and a few had been abandoned at the gate with nothing but their names pinned to their clothes. The orphanage relied on donations from the local temple and occasional government support, which meant the children often went without luxuries, but never without meals. The staff consisted of Sister Meili, 2 teachers, a cook, and the groundskeeper named Savan, who had worked there longer than anyone could remember. Life at the orphanage followed a strict routine: morning prayers at 6, breakfast at 7, lessons until noon, chores in the afternoon, and evening prayers before bed. It was not a joyful place, but it was stable, and stability was something these children desperately needed. The courtyard was the heart of their world, a dusty rectangle where they played games with homemade toys and sat in circles to tell stories when the heat became unbearable. The mango trees provided shade, and during the right season, fruit that the children would fight over with playful determination. It was in this courtyard that everything began to change. The first proper sighting happened on a Tuesday morning in late October. 9-year-old Dara was sweeping the courtyard as part of her morning chores when she saw a boy she didn't recognize standing near the well. He looked younger than her, perhaps 6 or 7, dressed in clothes that seemed oddly formal. A white shirt buttoned to the neck and dark shorts that reached his knees. His hair was neatly combed, which struck her as strange, because none of the boys at the orphanage bothered with their appearance unless Sister Meili forced them to. She called out to him, asking if he was new, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and looked directly at her with an expression she would later describe as worried. She took a few steps closer, broom still in hand, and that's when she noticed it. The morning sun was bright and low in the sky, casting long shadows from every object in the courtyard. The trees, the well, the building corners, even her own shadow stretched out behind her. But the boy had none. Where his shadow should have been, there was only empty ground, as if he were somehow exempt from the laws of light. Dara dropped her broom, and the clatter made several other children look up from their tasks. By the time they turned to see what had startled her, the boy was gone. She tried to explain what she'd seen, but the words came out jumbled and frantic. The other children teased her at first, saying she'd fallen asleep standing up and dreamed the whole thing, but something in her face made them stop laughing. Sister Meili was informed, and she questioned Dara carefully, looking for signs that the girl was making up stories for attention. But Dara was not a dramatic child. She was quiet and thoughtful, and Sister Meili knew when someone was lying. She told Dara that perhaps the angle of the sun had played tricks on her eyes, and that there was no boy at the orphanage who fit that description. The matter was dismissed, though Sister Meili made a mental note to watch for any signs of stress or illness in the child. That night, Dara lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of the other girls sleeping around her, and she couldn't shake the image of that boy's face, the way he had looked at her with such clear concern, as if he were trying to warn her of something she couldn't yet understand. Over the following weeks, more children reported seeing the boy. He appeared at different times of day, always in the courtyard, never inside the buildings. Sometimes he was by the well, other times near the mango trees or standing by the gate. He never spoke, but several children said he would gesture, pointing at things or making motions with his hands that seemed urgent. 10-year-old Kosel saw him pointing at the cracked stone steps leading to the main building, and the next day, one of the younger children tripped on those very steps and broke his arm. 12-year-old Sophia saw him standing near the kitchen window, shaking his head slowly, and that afternoon, a gas leak was discovered that could have caused an explosion if the cook hadn't noticed the smell in time. The children began to talk about him in hushed voices during meals and before bed, creating their own mythology around his appearances. Some said he was a ghost, others said he was a guardian spirit sent to protect them. A few of the older children claimed he was a demon testing them, waiting for the right moment to do something terrible. Sister Meili tried to maintain order, insisting that there was no boy and that the children were feeding off each other's imaginations, but even she began to feel uneasy. The orphanage had always had its share of ghost stories. Children in such places always invented tales to explain the creaks and shadows that filled old buildings. But this was different. Too many children were seeing the same thing, describing him in identical ways without having coordinated their stories. She consulted with the head monk at the local temple, a kind old man who had blessed the orphanage many times over the years. He listened carefully to her concerns and then asked a question that made her stomach turn. He wanted to know if any children had died at the orphanage in recent years. Sister Meili told him no child had died there since she had taken over, but she knew the orphanage's history stretched back decades before her time, and she had never asked about such things. The monk agreed to visit the orphanage and perform a blessing ceremony. He arrived on a humid afternoon with 2 younger monks, carrying incense and holy water. The children were gathered in the courtyard and instructed to sit quietly while the monks chanted prayers and walked the perimeter of the space, sprinkling water and waving incense smoke into every corner. The ceremony took nearly an hour, and by the end, the air felt heavy and thick, as if the humidity had been pressed down by some invisible weight. The children were restless but obedient, and when it was over, the head monk spoke briefly with Sister Meili in private. He told her that the space felt troubled, that there was an energy present that did not belong to the living world, but he could not identify its source or intention. He advised her to be vigilant and to contact him immediately if anything else unusual occurred. She thanked him and watched as the monks departed, their orange robes bright against the dusty road. That night, the boy appeared again. This time, he was seen by 6 children simultaneously, all of them playing in the courtyard during the brief period of free time before dinner. He stood in the center of the space, directly beneath the place where the sun would cast no shadow, even if he had one. And he raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the storage shed at the back of the compound. The children froze, watching him. One of the braver boys, a teenager named Rithi, called out to him, asking what he wanted. The boy's expression shifted from concern to something closer to fear, and then he was gone, not running away or fading, but simply absent, as if he had been edited out of the scene entirely. The children reported this to Sister Meili immediately, their voices overlapping in their urgency. She felt a deep unease settle into her bones, but she forced herself to remain calm. She told them to go inside for dinner, and that she would investigate the storage shed herself. Sister Meili walked across the courtyard as the sun began to set, her shadow stretching long and thin behind her. The storage shed was old, a structure that predated even the main buildings, built from wood and corrugated metal that had rusted in patches. It was used to store old furniture, broken equipment, and boxes of records that dated back to the orphanage's founding. She had rarely gone inside herself, leaving that task to Savan when something needed to be retrieved. The door creaked as she pulled it open, and the smell of mildew and dust hit her immediately. She found a flashlight and stepped inside, sweeping the beam across stacks of chairs, broken bed frames, and shelves lined with cardboard boxes. Everything looked as it always had, untouched and slowly decaying. She was about to leave when the flashlight beam caught something that made her pause. In the back corner, partially hidden behind a stack of wooden crates, was a small metal box. It was old, the kind that might have been used to store documents or valuables, and it was covered in a layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been moved in years. She pulled it out and brushed off the lid, revealing a simple latch that opened easily. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, black and white and faded with age. They showed children from decades past, standing in rows for formal portraits, their faces serious and their clothes neat. She recognized the courtyard in the background of several photos, though the buildings looked newer and the mango trees were much smaller. As she flipped through the images, one photograph made her hands go still. It showed a young boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wearing a white shirt buttoned to the neck and dark shorts. His hair was neatly combed, and his expression was solemn. Written on the back in faded ink was a name and a date. The name was Viesna, and the date was 1973. Beneath that, in different handwriting, someone had added a single word: lost. Sister Molly took the photograph and the box back to her office, her mind racing with questions. She spent the evening going through the old records she kept in her filing cabinets, searching for any mention of a child named Viesna. It took hours, but eventually she found a brittle ledger from the 1970s, its pages yellowed and its ink smudged in places. The entries were handwritten, recording admissions and departures, names and ages, and brief notes about each child's situation. She found Viesna's entry near the middle of the book. He had been admitted to the orphanage in January of 1973 at the age of 6, brought by a distant relative who could no longer care for him. The notes described him as quiet and well-behaved, and there were several entries documenting his daily life: lessons attended, chores completed, health checks passed. Then, in April of the same year, there was a final entry that made Sister Mally's breath catch. It stated simply that Viesna had disappeared during the night. A search had been conducted, but no trace of him was found. The prevailing theory at the time was that he had run away, though the staff noted that he had shown no signs of wanting to leave and had no family to run toward. The entry ended with the word unresolved, and after that, his name never appeared in the records again. Sister Meili sat back in her chair, the photograph clutched in her hand. The boy, the children, had been seeing matched Viesna's description perfectly, down to the formal clothes and neat hair. But what did it mean that he had no shadow? And why was he appearing now, more than 50 years after his disappearance? She thought about the way he pointed at things, the warnings he seemed to be giving. If he was trying to protect the children, what was he protecting them from? The sightings continued, growing more frequent and more urgent. Viesna appeared nearly every day now, sometimes multiple times, and his gestures became more frantic. He would point at the buildings, at the walls, at the ground beneath the children's feet. He never came close to anyone, always maintaining a distance of several meters, but his presence was impossible to ignore. The children began to feel a strange mix of fear and affection for him, as if he were both a ghost and a guardian, something to be afraid of, but also something that cared about their safety. Sister Molly contacted the monk again, showing him the photograph and the old records. He studied them carefully, his weathered face grave. He told her that spirits who remained tied to a place often did so because of unfinished business, something left undone or unresolved at the time of their death. In Viesna's case, he had disappeared without explanation, his fate unknown, which meant his spirit might be trapped between worlds, unable to move on until the truth was revealed. The monk warned her that such spirits could become dangerous if they grew too desperate, that their need for resolution could manifest in ways that harmed the living. He offered to perform a more intensive ritual, but Sister Meili hesitated. Something about Viesna's behavior suggested he was not trying to harm anyone, he was trying to save them. From what, she still didn't know. But she felt certain that understanding his warnings was more important than trying to banish him. On a Wednesday morning in mid-December, the temperature dropped suddenly, unusual for the region, even in the cooler months. The children woke to find frost on the windows, something none of them had ever seen before. The air felt sharp and brittle, and when they gathered in the courtyard for morning assembly, their breath came out in visible clouds. Viesna appeared immediately, standing near the center of the space, his form more solid and vivid than it had ever been. He looked directly at Sister Meili, his small face twisted with urgency, and he began to gesture wildly at the ground, not just pointing now, but stamping his feet as if trying to break through something invisible. Several of the children started crying, frightened by his intensity, and Sister Meili ordered everyone inside except for Sauvan and herself. She approached Viesna slowly, her heart pounding, and she asked him aloud what he was trying to show her. For a moment, he stopped moving and looked at her with an expression of profound sadness. Then he knelt down, pressing both hands flat against the dirt, and when he lifted them, his palms were dark with something that looked like ash. He vanished an instant later, leaving only the marks of his hands on the ground. Sister Meili knelt where he had been and brushed away the top layer of dirt. Beneath it, the soil was darker, almost black, and it felt warm to the touch despite the cold air. She called Sauvan over and told him to fetch a shovel. They dug carefully, not knowing what they were looking for but feeling compelled to continue. About 2 feet down, the shovel struck something solid. Sauvan cleared the dirt away with his hands, revealing old wooden planks, rotted and fragile. Beneath the planks was a small space, a hollow that had been covered over and forgotten. Inside the hollow were bones, small and delicate, unmistakably those of a child. There were also remnants of fabric, a white shirt and dark shorts, preserved in patches by the dry soil. Sister Molly covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. They had found Viesna, or what remained of him, buried beneath the courtyard where the children played every day. The discovery answered one question, but raised a dozen more. How had he died? Who had buried him here? And why had it been hidden for so long? The police were called, and within hours the orphanage was swarming with officials. The bones were carefully excavated and taken for analysis, and the old records were seized as evidence. The investigation revealed that in 1973, the orphanage had been under different management, a director who had been known for harsh discipline and who had left suddenly a few months after Viesna's disappearance. There were whispers among the older community members, stories about cruelty and accidents that had been covered up, but nothing concrete. The forensic examination of the bones showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, suggesting that Viesna had died from a blow to the head. Whether it was accidental or intentional could not be determined, but it was clear that his death had been concealed, his body buried in secret to avoid scandal or consequences. The orphanage was closed temporarily while the investigation continued. The children were moved to other facilities, and Sister Mally was placed on leave, though she was not suspected of any wrongdoing. She returned to the orphanage one last time to collect her belongings, walking through the empty courtyard where Viesna had appeared so many times. The space felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. She stood in the center of the courtyard, where they had dug up his remains, and she whispered an apology to the boy who had tried so hard to be found. That night, a fire broke out in the main building. The cause was never definitively determined, though investigators suspected old wiring or a gas leak. By the time the fire department arrived, the flames had consumed most of the structure, leaving only blackened walls and ash. The other buildings were damaged, but not destroyed, and the courtyard, strangely, was untouched. In the weeks that followed, there were no more sightings of Viesna. The children who had seen him reported feeling a sense of relief mixed with sadness, as if something they had come to depend on was now gone. Sister Mally never returned to work at the orphanage. The property was eventually sold, and the land was cleared to build apartments. But those who had been there during those final months never forgot the boy without a shadow, the ghost who had warned them of dangers they couldn't see, and who had finally, after more than 50 years, been allowed to rest. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But the shadows of tragedy do not always rest in the ground. Sometimes they linger in the places where the earth itself seems to breathe, in caves carved by ancient waters and time, where the air carries voices that should have been silenced long ago. In the northern reaches of Vietnam, deep within the labyrinthine caves of Har Long, another kind of ghost has made her presence known, and those who have heard her singing can never quite forget the sound, haunting and beautiful and utterly wrong in the darkness where no living person should be. The exploration team had been planning the expedition for 8 months, coordinating permits and logistics and gathering the specialized equipment needed to venture into the deeper sections of the Har Long cave system. The caves were famous among tourists for their accessible chambers, vast spaces lit by installed lighting where visitors could walk on paved paths and take photographs of stunning limestone formations. But beyond those areas, far past the boundaries where tourists were allowed, lay networks of unmapped tunnels that descended into the earth for kilometers, twisting and turning in ways that defied easy navigation. Dr. Lin Tran was the team leader, a geologist with 15 years of experience in cave systems throughout Southeast Asia. She had assembled a group of 6 people for this expedition, 2 other scientists, a professional cave diver, a photographer documenting the journey, and 2 local guides who knew the outer sections of the caves better than anyone. They entered the caves on a clear morning in late March, when the weather was stable and the risk of flooding was low. The first few hours were straightforward, following known paths that gradually narrowed and descended, leaving behind the reinforced walkways and electric lights of the tourist areas. They used headlamps and handheld lights, their beams cutting through darkness that seemed to press against them from all sides. By the time they reached what they considered the true beginning of unexplored territory, it was early afternoon, though time lost, meaning in the perpetual darkness of the caves. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the air was thick with moisture that made their clothes cling to their skin. The walls glistened with mineral deposits, and the floor was uneven, requiring careful attention with every step. Dr. Tran had mapped out a route based on preliminary surveys and old records from previous expeditions that had ventured this far, though none had gone much deeper. The plan was to explore for 6 hours, document their findings, and then return to the surface before nightfall. Everything went according to plan for the first 3 hours. They discovered several chambers that showed no signs of previous human presence, photographed unusual rock formations, and collected mineral samples. The team worked efficiently, their movements practiced and coordinated. It was during their 4th hour underground that Min, one of the local guides, stopped suddenly and held up his hand for silence. The group froze, their lights creating overlapping circles on the cave walls. In the stillness, they heard it, a voice, faint and distant, singing. The sound was unlike anything they had expected to encounter. It was a woman's voice, clear and melodic, singing what seemed to be a lullaby in an old Vietnamese dialect. The melody was simple and repetitive, the kind of song a mother might sing to soothe a child to sleep. But here, hundreds of meters below the surface, in a place where no one should be, the sound was profoundly unsettling. Dr. Tran asked if anyone recognized the song, and Min nodded slowly. He said it was a traditional lullaby from the war era, something his grandmother used to sing, but he couldn't understand why anyone would be singing it here. The team exchanged uneasy glances, and Dr. Tran made the decision to investigate. They followed the sound, moving carefully through a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. The singing grew louder as they approached, echoing off the stone walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its origin. When they entered the chamber, their lights revealed a space roughly 30 meters across, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadow. Stalactites hung like teeth, and a shallow pool of water covered part of the floor, its surface perfectly still. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space with its eerie melody. Then, without warning, all of their lights flickered and went out simultaneously. The darkness was absolute and disorienting, the kind of darkness that exists only in places completely sealed off from any hint of sunlight. Several members of the team gasped or cursed, fumbling for their backup lights. Dr. Tran's voice cut through the panic, calm and authoritative, telling everyone to stay still and check their equipment. One by one, the lights came back on, though they flickered weakly, as if the batteries were nearly dead despite being fresh that morning. The singing had stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse, heavy, and expectant. They swept their lights around the chamber, looking for any sign of another person, but there was nothing. No footprints in the dust, no marks on the walls, no indication that anyone else had been there. The photographer, a young woman named Hoa, pointed out that the acoustics of the cave could carry sounds from distant chambers, making them seem closer than they were. It was a logical explanation, and several members of the team seemed relieved to accept it, but Min shook his head slowly. He said the singing had been too clear, too present, to have traveled far through the tunnels. More than that, he said, the song had stopped the instant their lights went out, as if whoever was singing had been aware of them and had chosen that moment to go silent. Dr. Tran suggested they mark the chamber on their map and continue with the original plan. But as they prepared to move on, the singing started again. This time it was different. Not a lullaby, but something that sounded like a call, a name repeated over and over in a voice thick with desperation. The name was Mai, and it was sung with such longing and grief that it made several members of the team visibly uncomfortable. Hoa said they should leave, that something about this place felt wrong. But Dr. Tran insisted they needed to document what they were experiencing. She activated a recording device and captured several minutes of the singing before it faded away again. The team pressed forward, moving through a series of connected chambers that grew progressively narrower and more difficult to navigate. The singing followed them, sometimes distant and sometimes alarmingly close, always in the same woman's voice, always with that same haunting quality. At one point, the cave diver, a man named Tuan, asked if they had considered that the voice might not be human. He said it didn't sound quite right, that there was something off about the tone and the rhythm, as if it were an imitation of singing rather than the real thing. No one responded to his comment, but the unease in the group was palpable. They reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 separate passages, each descending at a different angle. Dr. Tran consulted her map and notes, trying to determine which route would be most productive. But as she studied the passages, she realized something that made her stomach drop. The layout of the tunnels had changed. According to her map, there should have been only 2 passages at this junction, not 3, and the angles were wrong. She double-checked her measurements, thinking she had made an error, but the numbers didn't lie. Either her map was fundamentally flawed, which seemed unlikely given how carefully it had been prepared, or the caves themselves had somehow shifted. She shared this information with the team, trying to keep her voice steady, and the reaction was immediate. Several people began talking at once, questioning whether they should turn back, suggesting that they had gotten disoriented in the darkness. Min said something that silenced everyone. He said the caves were known to change, that the old stories spoke of tunnels that moved and spaces that appeared and disappeared, but he had always thought those were just legends meant to keep people from venturing too deep. Now, standing at this impossible junction, he wasn't so sure. The decision was made to turn back, to retrace their steps to the surface and regroup before attempting another expedition with better equipment and more information. But as they turned around, they realized that the passage they had just come through looked different. The walls were the same, the formations identical, but the tunnel seemed longer, stretching back farther than it should have. Dr. Tran marked the wall with spray paint, a bright orange X that would serve as a reference point, and they began walking back the way they had come. After 20 minutes of steady walking, they should have reached the chamber where they had first heard the singing, but instead they found themselves in an unfamiliar space, a narrow corridor with a low ceiling that none of them remembered passing through. The orange X they had marked was nowhere to be seen. Panic began to set in, though Dr. Tran did her best to maintain order. She told everyone to stay together, to keep moving forward, and to trust that they would find their way out. But privately, she was terrified. She had been in dozens of cave systems, some far more complex than this, and she had never experienced anything like what was happening now. The singing returned, louder and more insistent than before. It came from ahead of them, from the direction they were walking, and it no longer sounded like a lullaby or a call. It sounded like a warning, sharp and urgent, the words indistinct, but the emotion unmistakable. The team hesitated, unsure whether to continue toward the bang sound or try to find another route. Before they could decide, their lights began to flicker again, not all at once, but in a wave, starting with the person at the front of the group and moving backward. One by one, the beams dimmed and died, plunging sections of the group into darkness before sputtering back to life. In those moments of darkness, several people reported seeing something, a figure standing at the edge of the light, a woman in old clothing, her hair long and disheveled, her face pale and indistinct. When the lights came back on, there was nothing there. Hoa began to cry, saying they needed to leave immediately, that they were going to die down here if they didn't find the exit. Dr. Tran tried to comfort her, but she felt the same fear gnawing at her own resolve. They pressed on, and after what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, they emerged into a chamber that looked familiar. It was the first large space they had entered after leaving the tourist areas, a landmark they had all noted on the way in. Relief flooded through the group, and they moved quickly toward the exit passage, eager to reach the surface. But as they entered the passage, the singing erupted all around them, no longer distant or faint, but deafeningly loud, as if the woman were standing among them, singing directly into their ears. The sound was overwhelming, filling their heads, and making it impossible to think. Several people covered their ears, shouting to be heard over the noise, and in the chaos, Min stumbled and fell, dropping his light. As he scrambled to retrieve it, he looked up and saw her, the woman, standing just a few meters away. She was not solid, but not quite transparent either, her form flickering like an image on a damaged film reel. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and her mouth moved in time with the singing, but her expression was not angry or malicious. It was desperate, pleading, as if she were begging them to understand something. Min shouted for the others to look, but by the time they turned, she was gone and the singing had stopped. The team made it to the surface as the sun was setting, emerging from the cave entrance into air that felt impossibly fresh and clean after hours in the stale darkness below. They collapsed on the ground, exhausted and shaken, and for several minutes no one spoke. Dr. Tran checked her equipment and found that her recording device had captured nothing but static, despite having functioned perfectly when she tested it earlier. The photographs Hoa had taken in the deeper chambers were similarly corrupted, showing only blurred shapes and strange light artifacts. It was as if the caves themselves had rejected any attempt to document what lay within. The team returned to their base camp and spent the evening discussing what had happened, trying to find rational explanations for the singing, the shifting tunnels, and the figure they had seen. But no explanation felt adequate. Min shared what he knew of the local legends, stories passed down through generations about a woman who had died in the caves during the war. She had been fleeing with her young daughter, trying to escape the bombing and chaos, and they had taken shelter in the caves, along with dozens of other refugees. At some point, the daughter had wandered off, lost in the dark maze of tunnels, and the mother had gone after her. Neither of them was ever seen again. The story said that the mother's spirit still searched the caves, singing lullabies and calling her daughter's name, unable to accept that she was gone. Dr. Tran listened to the story with a mix of skepticism and unease. She was a scientist, trained to rely on evidence and logic, but what they had experienced defied easy categorization. Over the following days, she contacted other researchers who had explored the Harlong caves, asking if they had encountered anything unusual. Several admitted, reluctantly, that they had heard singing or voices during their expeditions, though most had dismissed it as auditory hallucinations brought on by the isolation and darkness. One retired geologist told her, off the record, that he had stopped exploring those caves after an experience similar to hers, an encounter with something that couldn't be explained and that had left him deeply unsettled. He advised her to let it go, to chalk it up to the mysteries of the natural world and move on. But Dr. Tran couldn't let it go. She felt a responsibility to understand what they had encountered, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the sake of anyone else who might venture into those depths. She returned to the caves alone several weeks later, against the advice of her colleagues and the protests of her family. She brought only basic equipment and a voice recorder, and she descended into the tunnels with a single question in mind. If the spirit was searching for her daughter, was there any way to help her find peace? She walked for hours, retracing the route as best she could remember, and she called out into the darkness, speaking in Vietnamese, saying that she understood the woman was looking for someone, that she was sorry for what had happened, and that it was time to rest. For a long time there was only silence. Then, faint and far away, she heard the singing again, but this time it was different. It was soft and sad, a lullaby sung not in desperation but in resignation, as if the woman had finally accepted what could not be changed. Doctor. Tran stood in the darkness, tears streaming down her face, and she listened until the singing faded away completely. She never heard it again. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The stories we've shared so far have taken us to places where the past refuses to stay buried, where the dead reach out to the living in ways that cannot be ignored. But what comes next delves into something even more unsettling, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur, and where the things that haunt us are not always spirits of the departed. In the next part, we will explore horrors that are harder to name, mysteries that twist logic itself, and encounters that leave those who survive them questioning everything they thought they knew about the world. The stepwell was discovered by accident, hidden beneath decades of overgrowth and the slow accumulation of dirt that time deposits over forgotten places. Raj had been walking through the outskirts of Ahmedabad with his camera, searching for architectural subjects that hadn't been photographed 1,000 times before, when he noticed an unusual depression in the ground near a cluster of old trees. The earth seemed to slope downward in a way that suggested human construction rather than natural formation. He climbed down carefully, pushing aside vines and branches, and found himself at the top of a stone stairway that descended into darkness. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and the walls on either side were carved with intricate patterns that had been softened by erosion. He took a few photographs from the entrance, but the light was poor and the shadows too deep to capture the full scale of what lay below. He decided to return the next day with better equipment and perhaps a companion, because something about the place made him uneasy in a way he couldn't articulate. As he turned to leave, he thought he saw movement in the darkness below, a pale shape that seemed to drift across his field of vision before vanishing. He told himself it was just his eyes adjusting to the dim light, but the image stayed with him all evening. The stepwell had been built sometime in the 15th century, part of a network of such structures that served both practical and spiritual purposes in the region. They provided access to groundwater during the dry season, and their elaborate architecture made them gathering places for communities, spaces where people came not just to collect water but to socialize, to pray, and to escape the heat. This particular stepwell had been forgotten after the area was abandoned during one of the many conflicts that had swept through the region over the centuries. The village that once surrounded it had disappeared, its inhabitants scattered or absorbed into other settlements, and the stepwell had been left to nature. Raj spent the evening researching what he could find about the site, discovering only brief mentions in historical surveys that described its dimensions and architectural style but offered little else. There were no legends associated with it, no recorded tragedies, nothing that would explain the unease he had felt. The next morning, he convinced his friend Priya to accompany him. She was a historian who specialized in medieval architecture, and she was immediately excited by the prospect of exploring an unmapped stepwell. They arrived at the site around 9 in the morning, carrying flashlights, rope, and camera equipment. The entrance looked different in daylight, less ominous, but still somehow unwelcoming. The stairs descended in a series of levels, each one featuring a small platform with carved pillars before continuing downward. The design was meant to create a rhythmic, almost meditative experience for those who walked it, each level bringing them closer to the water below while keeping them connected to the sky above through the open well shaft. They descended slowly, pausing at each level to photograph the carvings and measure the dimensions. The air grew cooler as they went deeper, and the light from above faded until their flashlights became the only source of illumination. The walls were covered in a thin layer of moss in places, and the stone was damp to the touch. Priya remarked on the quality of the craftsmanship, pointing out details in the carvings that indicated the work of highly skilled artisans. Raj was focused on his photography, trying to capture the interplay of light and shadow when he saw her again. The woman in white, standing on the platform 2 levels below them, perfectly still. He froze, his finger on the camera's shutter button, and he whispered to Priya to look down. By the time she followed his gaze, the figure was gone. He described what he had seen, a woman dressed in white, her clothing flowing as if caught in a breeze, even though the air was perfectly still. Priya suggested it might be someone else exploring the stepwell, perhaps a local who knew about the site, but Raj shook his head. The figure hadn't moved like a living person. She had been completely motionless one moment and absent the next, no transition between the two states. Priya looked skeptical but agreed to proceed cautiously. They continued their descent, calling out to announce their presence in case there was indeed someone else in the stepwell, but no one answered. The lower levels were darker and more deteriorated, the stone crumbling in places and the carvings obscured by mineral deposits. At the 7th level, they found water, a dark pool that filled the bottom of the well shaft. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting their flashlight beams like black glass. Raj photographed the water and the surrounding architecture, while Priya examined the walls, noting the waterline marks that showed how the level had fluctuated over the years. It was while they were both occupied with their work that they heard it, a sound like fabric brushing against stone, coming from somewhere above them. They both looked up, sweeping their lights across the levels they had already passed, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, and accompanied by the faint whisper of footsteps. Raj called out, asking if anyone was there, and his voice echoed strangely in the confined space, repeating back to him in layers that sounded almost like multiple voices. Priya gripped his arm, her earlier skepticism replaced by genuine fear. She said they should leave, that something didn't feel right, and Raj agreed. They began climbing back up, moving faster than they had descended, their flashlights bobbing with each step. On the 5th level, they saw her clearly. The woman in white stood at the center of the platform, blocking their path. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and her clothing was indeed white, a long dress or sari that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, wet and dripping despite the fact that the air was dry. Her face was beautiful but expressionless, and her eyes were fixed on something they couldn't see. Raj raised his camera instinctively and took a photograph, the flash illuminating the entire level for a split second. In that brief moment of light, they saw that she was not standing on the platform. Her feet hovered several inches above the stone surface. When the flash faded, she was gone, but the sound of dripping water continued, echoing in the darkness. Priya began to cry, saying they needed to leave immediately, and Raj didn't argue. They ran up the remaining levels, their breathing harsh and panicked, and they didn't stop until they emerged into sunlight. They collapsed on the ground near the entrance, their hearts pounding, and for several minutes neither of them could speak. Back at Raj's apartment, they reviewed the photographs he had taken. Most of them showed exactly what they had seen with their own eyes: the carved walls, the descending levels, the dark water at the bottom. But the photograph he had taken with the flash, the one that should have captured the woman in white, showed only an empty platform. There was no figure, no hovering dress, nothing to indicate that anything unusual had been there. Raj checked the camera settings in the memory card, thinking there might be a technical error, but everything was functioning normally. The photograph simply didn't show what he knew he had seen. Priya suggested that perhaps they had both experienced a shared hallucination brought on by the dim light and the enclosed space, but even as she said it, she didn't sound convinced. They spent the evening researching the stepwell more thoroughly, digging through archives and contacting local historians who might have information about the site. One elderly scholar responded to their inquiries with a brief but unsettling message. He said that the stepwell had been sealed off in the early 20th century after a series of drownings, though the official records attributed the deaths to accidents. Local stories, however, spoke of a woman who haunted the lower levels, a young bride who had thrown herself into the water when she learned that her husband had been killed in battle. The scholar noted that these stories were likely apocryphal, created to explain the accidents and give meaning to tragedy, but he acknowledged that the stepwell had a reputation among locals as a place to avoid. Raj and Priya debated whether to return to the stepwell, driven by a mix of curiosity and the need to understand what they had experienced. Raj wanted to go back with more equipment, to spend an entire day documenting the site properly, but Priya refused. She said that whatever was in that place had made its presence clear, and that continuing to intrude would be disrespectful at best and dangerous at worst. They argued about it for days, their friendship strained by the disagreement, until Raj finally decided to go alone. He returned to the stepwell on an overcast afternoon, telling himself that he was being rational, that he was simply a photographer doing his job. He descended the stairs with his camera and a powerful flashlight, moving quickly through the upper levels where the light from above still reached. As he approached the 5th level, where they had seen the woman, he slowed down, his senses heightened. The platform was empty, the stone showing no signs of recent disturbance. He set up his camera on a tripod and began taking long exposure shots, hoping to capture details that might explain what they had seen. It was during one of these exposures, while the camera shutter was open and he was standing perfectly still, that he felt it, a coldness that seeped into his bones, starting at his feet and rising through his body. The air around him seemed to thicken, and he heard the sound of water dripping, even though the nearest source was several levels below. He looked down and saw that his shoes were wet, water seeping up from the stone as if the platform were slowly flooding. He stepped back, but the water followed him, spreading across the surface in a way that defied physics, moving uphill and pooling around his feet. The temperature dropped further, and his breath came out in visible clouds. He grabbed his camera and turned to run, but she was there, standing between him and the stairs. Up close, she was even more disturbing than she had been from a distance. Her skin was pale and had a strange translucence, as if he could see the faint outline of bones beneath. Her eyes were dark and empty, not cruel, but infinitely sad, and when her mouth opened, water poured out, not a trickle, but a steady stream that splashed onto the stone and ran toward him. He tried to speak, to ask what she wanted, but his voice caught in his throat. She raised one hand slowly, pointing down toward the lower levels, and the gesture was unmistakable. She wanted him to follow her deeper into the stepwell. Raj shook his head, backing away, and as he moved, she began to drift toward him, not walking, but gliding across the flooded platform. He turned, and ran, abandoning his camera and tripod, and he didn't look back until he reached the surface. He never returned to the stepwell, and he never developed the photographs from that final visit. Priya eventually forgave him for going back alone, though she made him promise never to do it again. They reported their experiences to local authorities, suggesting that the site should be sealed or at least marked with warning signs, but their concerns were dismissed. The official position was that the stepwell was historically significant and should be preserved, not closed off based on unsubstantiated stories. In the months that followed, Raj heard through his network of photographer friends that other people had begun exploring the site, drawn by rumors of its beauty and mystery. Some of them reported strange experiences, glimpses of a woman in white, unexplained sounds, and sudden drops in temperature. Others saw nothing unusual and dismissed the stories as urban legends. Raj tried to move on, focusing on other projects and avoiding the area where the stepwell was hidden. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake from dreams of drowning, of being pulled down into dark water by hands that were gentle but unyielding. In those moments, he would remember the woman's face and the profound sadness in her eyes, and he would wonder if she was still down there, waiting at the 5th level, searching for something she would never find. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. Water has always held its own kind of terror, the way it can drown, freeze, and preserve all at once. In markets built by the sea, where the catch is brought in before dawn and the air smells of salt and fish, the boundary between the living and the drowned can become dangerously thin. In the port city of Kota Kinabalu, where the wet market opens while the stars are still visible, vendors know to arrive early not just for the best spots, but to avoid encountering something that should not be walking among the stalls, a boy whose presence brings the cold of the ocean depths with it. City had been working at the wet market for 12 years, ever since her husband's fishing boat had been lost in a storm, and she needed to support their 3 children alone. She sold dried fish and shrimp paste from a small stall near the center of the market, arriving each morning at 4:30 to set up before the early customers began to trickle in. The market was a sprawling complex of concrete floors and metal roofs, divided into sections for fish, meat, vegetables, and dry goods. During the day, it was crowded and noisy, full of haggling voices and the constant sound of cleavers striking cutting boards. But in the hours before dawn, when only the vendors were present, it was a different place, quieter and somehow more intimate, the sounds of preparation and the smell of the sea dominating the space. CT knew most of the other vendors by name, had watched their children grow and attended their family celebrations, and she took comfort in the routine and familiarity of her work. The market was not just her livelihood but her community, and she had thought she knew every corner of it, every quirk and shadow. That changed one morning in late August, when she saw the boy for the first time. She had arrived earlier than usual that day, unable to sleep after a difficult conversation with her eldest daughter about school fees. The market was nearly empty, just a handful of fish vendors unloading their night's catch from refrigerated trucks. City unlocked her stall and began arranging her products, working methodically in the dim light of the overhead bulbs that barely illuminated the space. She was focused on her task when she became aware of someone standing near her stall, watching her. She looked up, expecting to see another vendor or perhaps a homeless person seeking shelter, and instead saw a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing barefoot on the wet concrete floor. He wore shorts and a thin shirt, both soaked through, as if he had just climbed out of water and his hair was plastered to his head. His skin had a strange pallor, not just pale, but slightly grayish, and there was something about his stillness that was deeply unnatural. Children were not usually in the market at this hour, and certainly not alone and wet. CT asked him if he was lost, if he needed help, but the boy didn't respond. He simply stared at her with eyes that seemed too dark, too deep, and then he turned and walked away, his bare feet making soft, slapping sounds on the concrete. City watched him go, disturbed by the encounter but unsure what to do about it. She mentioned it to Pak Hassan, an older fish vendor whose stall was next to hers, and he frowned when she described the boy. He asked if the child's skin had looked waterlogged, if his fingers were wrinkled and pruned, and when City confirmed that they were, Pak Hassan's expression grew grave. He told her about a boy who had drowned 5 years earlier during a particularly violent storm. The child had been playing near the docks when a wave had swept him into the sea, and despite extensive search efforts, his body was never recovered. In the months following the drowning, several vendors had reported seeing a boy matching that description wandering the market before sunrise, always wet, always silent, always searching. Pak Hassan said that anyone who had touched the boy or tried to help him had experienced strange symptoms, an overwhelming coldness that seemed to come from within their bodies, and the sound of ocean waves in their ears that persisted for days. The sightings had eventually stopped, or at least the reports had, and most vendors had convinced themselves that the stories were exaggerations or misunderstandings. But Pak Hassan had seen the boy himself once, years ago, and he had never forgotten the encounter. He warned City to avoid the child if she saw him again, to not speak to him or acknowledge his presence, because engaging with the dead could have consequences neither of them wanted to face. City tried to dismiss the warning as superstition, but over the following weeks, she saw the boy 3 more times. Each encounter followed the same pattern. He would appear in the early morning hours when the market was still mostly empty, standing near her stall or walking slowly down the aisles between the vendors, his wet clothes dripping steadily onto the floor. He never spoke, never made any gesture toward her, but his presence filled her with a dread she couldn't explain rationally. Other vendors began to report similar sightings, and the stories spread through the market like a virus. Some vendors started arriving later to avoid the pre-dawn hours, while others brought protective amulets and charms, hanging them from their stalls to ward off spirits. The market's management received complaints and hired security guards to patrol the area, but the guards saw nothing unusual and dismissed the reports as mass hysteria. CT's sleep grew worse, plagued by dreams of drowning, of being pulled under cold water by small hands that gripped her ankles with surprising strength. She began to dread her morning routine, the walk through the dark streets to the market, the moment when she would unlock her stall and wonder if the boy would be there waiting. The situation escalated one morning in late September. CT arrived at her usual time and began setting up, deliberately not looking around for fear of what she might see. She was arranging packages of dried shrimp when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, expecting to see a fellow vendor, and found herself face to face with the boy. He was standing so close that she could see the individual droplets of water on his skin, could smell the sharp brine scent that surrounded him. His eyes were fixed on hers, and his mouth moved as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then he reached for her hand, his small fingers wrapping around her wrist, and the coldness was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't just the temperature of his skin, which felt like ice pulled from a freezer, but something deeper, as if the cold were spreading through her veins and into her core. She tried to pull away, but his grip was surprisingly strong, and for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. She stood frozen, unable to move or call for help. Then, Just as suddenly as he had appeared, he released her and stepped back, his expression shifting from desperation to something that might have been resignation. He turned and walked away, disappearing between the stalls, and City collapsed onto a plastic stool, her entire body shaking. The coldness didn't leave. Even as the sun rose and the market filled with people, even as the temperature climbed into the 80s and she began to sweat from the heat, CT felt frozen from the inside. Her fingers were numb and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Other vendors noticed and brought her hot tea, wrapping her in blankets despite the warmth of the day, but nothing helped. More disturbing was the sound, a constant roar of waves crashing against a shore, filling her ears and making it difficult to hear anything else. She tried to work, to go through the motions of selling her goods, but customers found her behavior strange and unsettling, and by midday, she had made almost no sales. Pak Hassan insisted on taking her to a traditional healer, a woman known for dealing with spiritual afflictions, and City was too weak to argue. The healer lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by gardens of medicinal plants. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and hands that moved with practiced confidence. She examined City carefully, touching her forehead and wrists, listening to her breathing, and finally pronouncing that she had been marked by a water spirit, specifically one that was bound to a place of drowning. The healer performed a cleansing ritual that involved burning herbs, chanting prayers, and washing Siti's hands and face with water that had been blessed at a local temple. The process took over an hour, and by the end, Siti felt marginally warmer, though the sound of waves persisted at a lower volume. The healer told her that the boy was not malicious. He was simply lost, trapped between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, unable to move on because he was searching for something he would never find. The healer said that the boy had likely been looking for his mother, clinging to the last memories he had before drowning, and that his appearances at the market were driven by confusion and longing rather than anger or revenge. She warned Siti that the boy would continue to appear until he either found what he was looking for or was properly put to rest through appropriate funeral rites. The problem was that without a body, conducting such rites was nearly impossible. The healer suggested that Siti and the other vendors who had encountered the boy pool their resources to sponsor a memorial ceremony at the site where he had drowned, offering prayers and making offerings to help guide his spirit to peace. Siti discussed the idea with Pak Hassan and several other vendors who had seen the boy, and after some debate, they agreed to organize the ceremony. They contacted the boy's family, who still lived in the area, and explained what had been happening. The family was initially skeptical, but ultimately agreed to participate, desperate for any chance to find closure after years of not knowing what had happened to their son's body. The ceremony was held on a Sunday morning at the dock where the boy had drowned, conducted by a Buddhist monk, and attended by 24 people, vendors, family members, and a few curious onlookers. Offerings of food, flowers, and incense were placed in a small boat that was then set adrift in the bay, carrying prayers for the boy's soul. The plays, monk chanted sutras, and the boy's mother, a woman who looked far older than her years, wept openly as she watched the boat float away. Siti stood among the crowd, feeling the weight of the moment, and she found herself silently apologizing to the boy for not understanding sooner, for being afraid instead of compassionate. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, she felt the coldness in her body finally start to fade, and the sound of waves in her ears grew quieter until it disappeared completely. In the weeks that followed, the sightings stopped. The boy was not seen again in the market, and the vendors who had encountered him reported feeling a sense of relief, as if a tension they hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted. City returned to her normal routine, arriving at the market before dawn and working through the day. But she found that she no longer felt afraid of the early morning darkness. Instead, she felt a strange kind of gratitude, as if the experience had taught her something important about the persistence of love and loss, about the ways that grief can trap us in cycles we can't escape without help. She thought about the boy's mother often, about the years she had spent not knowing, and about the small measure of peace the ceremony had hopefully provided. The market continued as it always had, loud and bustling and full of life, but Sidi never forgot the boy who had wandered its aisles searching for warmth, or the lesson his brief visits had taught her about the depths of human longing and the importance of letting go. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The encounters we've explored so far have shown spirits bound to specific places, tethered by tragedy and unfinished business. But the final stories take us somewhere different, to places where the horror is quieter, more insidious, where what haunts people isn't always visible or easily named. These last two tales are about the subtle ways fear can infiltrate daily life, about the moments when ordinary places reveal themselves to be anything but safe, and about the realization that some presences never truly leave, no matter how much time passes or how desperately we try to forget. What comes next is not loud or dramatic, but it lingers, settling into your thoughts like a whisper you can't quite make out, but can never entirely ignore. The trail had been used for centuries by nomadic herders moving their flocks between summer and winter pastures, a narrow path carved into the mountainside that offered stunning views of the valleys below and the snow-capped peaks rising in the distance. Timur Ridge was named after a legendary warrior who supposedly died in these mountains centuries ago, though local historians debated whether the stories were based on actual events or merely folklore that had accumulated over generations. The ridge itself was a popular destination for experienced hikers, challenging but not technically difficult, requiring only stamina and careful attention to the path. Elena had been planning this trek for months, coordinating with her hiking group from Almaty and arranging permits and accommodations in the small villages that dotted the approach routes. They were a group of 7, all in their 30s and 40s, all reasonably fit and experienced in mountain environments. The plan was to spend 4 days hiking the ridge, camping at designated sites, and carrying all their supplies with them. Everything went smoothly for the first day and a half. The weather held clear and cool, the trail was well marked, and the group maintained good spirits despite the physical demands of the terrain. It was on the second afternoon, when they had climbed above the tree line and were traversing a section of exposed rock, that Elena heard her name called from somewhere behind them. The voice was faint, but unmistakable, a woman's voice speaking in Russian, calling Elena's name with a familiar tone that suggested intimacy or urgency. Elena stopped and turned, scanning the landscape for the source, but saw only her hiking companions and the empty trails stretching back down the mountain. She called out, asking if anyone had heard it, and 2 others in the group nodded. They had heard something, too, though they couldn't agree on what it had been. One thought it was a name being called. The other thought it sounded like singing. Their guide, a local man named Askar, who had led groups through these mountains for over 20 years, listened to their descriptions with a neutral expression that didn't quite hide his concern. He told them that sound could carry strangely in the mountains, bouncing off rock faces and traveling through valleys in ways that made it seem closer or more distinct than it actually was. It was probably just voices from another group of hikers somewhere on the trail behind them, nothing to worry about. But Elena noticed that he increased their pace after that, pushing them to cover more ground before they stopped to make camp for the night. They reached their designated campsite just as the sun was setting, a small plateau with a clear spring and enough flat ground for their tents. The group set about preparing dinner and organizing their gear, tired but satisfied with the day's progress. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though she couldn't identify what exactly was bothering her. That night, after everyone had gone to their tents and the camp had settled into the quiet sounds of wind and distant water, Elena woke to the sound of her name being called again. This time it was closer, just outside her tent, and the voice was different. It sounded like her sister Natasha, using the affectionate nickname she had called Elena since childhood. Elena sat up in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding, and she listened intently. The voice came again, urgent now, saying her nickname and asking for help. Elena unzipped her tent and looked out into the darkness. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the campsite, casting everything in silver light and deep shadows. She saw nothing unusual, just the other tents arranged in a loose circle and the faint glow of the dying campfire. But the voice continued, moving away from the camp toward the tree line below their plateau. Elena knew rationally that her sister was in Almaty, hundreds of kilometers away, and that there was no possible way she could be here in the mountains calling for help. But the voice was so convincing, so perfectly matched to her sister's tone and inflection, that Elena found herself climbing out of her tent and walking toward the sound. She had taken perhaps 20 steps when a hand grabbed her shoulder, stopping her abruptly. It was Oscar, fully dressed and wide awake despite the late hour. He didn't say anything at first, just held her shoulder firmly and gestured for her to listen. The voice continued, calling from the darkness beyond the camp, but now Elena could hear that it wasn't quite right. The rhythm was off, the pauses between words too long, as if whoever was speaking was carefully imitating rather than naturally producing speech. Oscar led her back to the center of camp and woke the others, gathering everyone around the remnants of the fire. In a low voice, he told them what he had avoided mentioning earlier, that Timor Ridge had a reputation for strange occurrences, particularly involving voices that lured hikers off the established trails. The stories went back decades, accounts of people hearing loved ones calling to them from the forest or the mountainside, following those voices into areas where they became disoriented and lost. Some of those people were never found, while others were discovered days later, often injured and always deeply traumatized, unable or unwilling to describe what had happened to them. The local explanation varied depending on who you asked. Some said it was spirits of people who had died in the mountains. Others claimed it was something older and less human, a presence that had existed in these peaks long before people arrived. Asghar didn't speculate on what it actually was, but he made clear that the only safe response was to ignore the voices completely, to never follow them or respond to them, and to stay together as a group. The camp remained awake for the rest of the night, no one willing to be alone in their tent after what had been revealed. They heard the voices several more times, sometimes Elena's name, sometimes others in the group, always spoken in tones that suggested familiarity and need. Once, they heard what sounded like a child crying, which made several members of the group visibly distressed, but Oscar reminded them firmly that whatever was out there was not what it pretended to be. Morning came, slowly, the darkness giving way to gray light that revealed a landscape shrouded in mist. The group broke camp quickly and in near silence, everyone eager to continue moving and put distance between themselves and the site where they had spent such a disturbing night. As they packed their gear, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the soft earth near the tree line, where the voices had been calling from, were tracks. Not animal tracks or human footprints, but impressions that looked like they had been made by something dragging itself across the ground. Long, thin marks that suggested limbs far too elongated to be natural. The tracks led from the forest up toward their camp, stopping just a few meters from where Elena's tent had been pitched. Asker saw her looking at the tracks and quickly moved to block the other group members from noticing them, ushering everyone onto the trail before anyone else could examine the site too closely. They hiked for hours without stopping, driven by a collective desire to leave that place behind, and it wasn't until they reached a section of trail that was fully exposed to sunlight that Asker finally allowed them to rest. During their break, one of the hikers, a man named Dmitri, who had been quieter than usual all morning, mentioned that he had seen something during the night that he hadn't wanted to bring up in front of the others. He had gotten up to relieve himself around 3 a.m, walking a short distance from his tent to maintain some privacy, when he saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and thin, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. The figure had been perfectly still, and in the moonlight, Dmitri couldn't make out any features. It was just a silhouette, dark against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest. He had frozen, terrified to move or make a sound, and after what felt like several minutes, the figure had simply melted back into the trees, not walking away, but seeming to dissolve into the shadows. He admitted he had convinced himself it was a dream or a trick of the light, but after hearing Asker's warnings and seeing everyone's reaction to the voices, he realized it had been real. The group absorbed this information in heavy silence, and Elena felt a retrospective terror at how close she had come to following the voice into the forest, to walking toward whatever Dmitri had seen, waiting in the darkness. They completed the trek 2 days later, cutting their planned route short and descending via a different path that bypassed the higher elevations of Timur Ridge. No one complained about the change in plans. The experience of that night had shaken all of them profoundly, replacing their enthusiasm for adventure with a desperate need to return to civilization. When they finally reached the town where they had started, they went their separate ways quickly, exchanging contact information, but avoiding any extended conversation about what had happened. Elena returned to Almaty and tried to resume her normal life, but she found herself plagued by nightmares and an irrational fear of hearing her name called when she was alone. She researched the area obsessively, finding scattered references to similar incidents, blog posts from hikers who described hearing voices, official reports of missing persons in that region, and even a few academic papers on auditory phenomena in mountain environments that tried to explain the experiences through natural causes, like wind patterns and acoustic anomalies. None of the scientific explanations felt adequate to her. They didn't account for the specificity of what she had heard, the perfect imitation of her sister's voice, or the tracks she had seen in the earth. She eventually contacted Asker, hoping to talk to someone who would understand, and he confirmed that what they had experienced was relatively common in that area, though most guides avoided discussing it with clients to prevent panic or cancellations. Asker told her about other incidents he had witnessed over the years, groups who had lost members to the voices, people who had wandered off in the night and were found days later, often in places that shouldn't have been accessible, given the terrain and the time elapsed. He described one particularly disturbing case where a hiker had been found sitting calmly on a rock ledge, several kilometers from where he had disappeared, unable to explain how he had gotten there or what had happened during the hours he was missing. The man had no injuries, but seemed fundamentally changed, speaking rarely and avoiding eye contact, and he had refused ever to discuss the details of his experience. Oskar said that he personally believed there was something in those mountains that fed on human loneliness or longing, that used our connections to loved ones as a way to manipulate and isolate us. Whether it was supernatural or something else entirely, he didn't know, but he had learned through experience that the only defense was awareness and absolute discipline in ignoring the voices, no matter how convincing they seemed. Elena thanked him for his honesty and for saving her that night, and she made a private decision never to return to mountain hiking, at least not in that region. The experience had fundamentally altered her relationship with wilderness spaces, infecting them with a sense of menace that she couldn't shake. She still heard her name called sometimes, in crowded streets or quiet rooms, and each time it happened, she would freeze and force herself to breathe slowly, reminding herself that it wasn't real, that whatever had been in those mountains couldn't follow her here. But part of her, the part that had heard her sister's voice in the darkness and nearly followed it to whatever waited in the trees, was never entirely convinced. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. From the isolation of mountain peaks to the crowded anonymity of urban life, horror takes different forms but maintains the same essential quality, an intrusion of the impossible into spaces we consider safe. In Tokyo's vast network of roads and tunnels, where millions of people move through the city every day in cars and taxis, there are routes that drivers learn to avoid for reasons that have nothing to do with traffic or tolls. Tunnel 3, beneath Shibuya, is one such place. A perfectly ordinary concrete passage that carries vehicles between neighborhoods, unremarkable during daylight hours but transformed after midnight into something that taxi drivers whisper about in their break rooms, a place where passengers sometimes appear who should not be there, who cannot be explained, and who leave behind only the memory of cold terror and windows cracked from the inside out. Kenji had been driving a taxi in Tokyo for 16 years, long enough to know every shortcut and alternate route, every spot where traffic tended to bottleneck, and every area where he was likely to pick up profitable fares. He worked the night shift by choice, preferring the quieter streets and the higher rates that came with late-night and early morning rides. His passengers during these hours were a mix of businessmen too drunk to drive home after client dinners, young people leaving clubs and bars, and shift workers heading to or from jobs that kept the city running while most people slept. Kenji prided himself on his professionalism, maintaining a clean vehicle, following the most efficient routes, and engaging in polite conversation when passengers seemed receptive while respecting the silence of those who preferred not to talk. He had heard the stories about Tunnel 3, every driver had, but he had always dismissed them as urban legends, the kind of tales that circulated among people who spent too many hours alone in their cars, driving through empty streets where the mind could play tricks. He had driven through Tunnel 3 hundreds of times, at all hours of day and night, and he had never experienced anything unusual. That changed on a Tuesday night in October when he picked up a fare in Roppongi just after midnight. The passenger was a middle-aged businessman, well-dressed and polite, who gave an address in a residential neighborhood on the other side of Shibuya. Kenji input the destination into his GPS and noted that the fastest route would take them through Tunnel 3. He felt a momentary hesitation, remembering the stories, but dismissed it as superstition and pulled into traffic. The businessman was quiet, absorbed in his phone, and Kenji focused on driving, navigating the late-night traffic with practiced ease. They entered the tunnel smoothly, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead creating a rhythmic pattern as they passed. Beneath each fixture, the tunnel was perhaps 800 meters long, a straight shot with gentle curves at either end, and traffic was light enough that Kenji could maintain a steady speed. They were about halfway through when he glanced in his rearview mirror to check on his passenger and saw that someone else was sitting in the back seat, not next to the businessman, but directly behind Kenji, in a position that should have been empty because his passenger was seated on the right side. The figure was a girl, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, wearing what looked like a school uniform. Her head was bowed, her long black hair falling forward to obscure her face, and she sat with an unnatural stillness that immediately struck Kenji as wrong. He blinked and looked again, thinking his eyes had deceived him or that he was seeing a reflection of something outside the car, but the girl remained visible in the mirror. His businessman passenger seemed unaware of her presence, still focused on his phone. Kenji's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he felt his heart rate accelerate. He wanted to turn around and look directly at the back seat, but some instinct told him that would be a mistake, that acknowledging what he was seeing would make it more real somehow. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, trying to convince himself that he was imagining things. But in the mirror, he saw the girl slowly raise her head. Where her eyes should have been, there were only smooth expanses of skin, as if the sockets had been sealed over. Her mouth opened, and though Kenji heard no sound over the noise of the car and the tunnel, he could see her lips forming words. The businessman's phone suddenly went dark, and he looked up, glancing around the car with an expression of mild confusion, but he gave no indication that he saw the girl. Kenji forced himself to look back at the road, his breathing shallow and rapid. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the car's air conditioning. In the mirror, the girl remained visible, and now she was leaning forward slightly, her eyeless face tilted as if she were looking directly at Kenji's reflection. Her lips continued to move, and though he still couldn't hear her, he somehow understood what she was saying. "Take me home." The words repeated in his mind with increasing urgency, not as sound but as a presence, an intrusive thought that didn't feel like his own. Kenji tried to ignore it, focusing on maintaining his speed and getting through the tunnel as quickly as possible without appearing to flee. They were perhaps 200 meters from the exit when the first impact came. A sudden violent bang against the passenger side window that made both Kenji and his passenger jump in surprise. The businessman turned to look at the window, and Kenji saw in the mirror that the girl was now sitting up straight, her hands raised and formed into fists. She struck the window again, and this time the sound was accompanied by a visible crack spreading across the glass. The businessman shouted in alarm, asking what was happening, and Kenji couldn't answer because he didn't know what to say. The girl struck the window a third time, and the crack expanded into a spiderweb pattern. The businessman scrambled to the other side of the back seat, as far from the damaged window as he could get, and he began demanding that Kenji stop the car. But stopping in the tunnel felt like the worst possible option. Some deep survival instinct told Kenji that they needed to get out, to reach the open air beyond the concrete walls. He pressed the accelerator, and the car surged forward. The girl was now pounding on both windows, her small fists moving with impossible speed and force, and the sound was deafening, a rapid percussion that drowned out everything else. More cracks appeared in the glass, spreading and intersecting, and Kenji could see his passenger's terrified face in the mirror, the man clearly visible while the girl remained somehow separate, present in the reflection but not quite fully there. They burst out of the tunnel into the open night, and the pounding stopped instantly. Kenji looked in the mirror and saw only his passenger, pressed against the far door, breathing heavily and staring at the damaged windows with wide eyes. The girl was gone. Kenji pulled over as soon as he found a safe spot, stopping on a quiet side street and turning on his hazard lights. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. The businessman stumbled out of the car, looking at the cracked windows with an expression of complete bewilderment. He asked Kenji what had just happened, demanding an explanation for the damage, and Kenji found himself unable to speak coherently. He managed to say something about a malfunction, about pressure changes in the tunnel, knowing even as he said it that the explanation was absurd. The windows hadn't shattered from pressure. They had been struck repeatedly from the inside by something the businessman hadn't been able to see, but that Kenji had witnessed clearly in his mirror. The businessman was angry now, talking about reporting this incident and demanding compensation, and Kenji could only nod and agree, giving the man his company's information and watching him storm off to find another taxi. Once he was alone, Kenji sat in his car and tried to process what had happened. The rational part of his mind insisted it had been a hallucination, stress, or fatigue causing him to see things that weren't there. But the cracked windows were real, undeniable physical evidence that something had occurred. He drove back to his company's garage, not trusting himself to pick up any more fares that night. The dispatcher asked about the damage to his vehicle, and Kenji gave the same vague explanation about pressure issues in the tunnel, knowing it sounded implausible, but unable to offer anything better. The dispatcher seemed skeptical but accepted the report and told Kenji to take the car to the repair shop in the morning. As Kenji was filling out the incident paperwork, another driver came in from his shift, an older man named Sato who had been with the company for over 20 years. Sato glanced at the damaged taxi and asked Kenji which tunnel he had been in when it happened. When Kenji admitted it was Tunnel 3, Sato nodded slowly and said that he wasn't surprised. He led Kenji to the break room, poured them both coffee, and told him about his own experience with the tunnel and the girl without eyes. Sato's encounter had happened 7 years earlier, and the details were eerily similar. A passenger he was transporting, a figure that appeared in the rearview mirror but not in direct sight, the voiceless words demanding to be taken home, and the violent assault on the windows that ceased the moment they exited the tunnel. Sato said he had reported it at the time but had been dismissed and mocked, told he was seeing things or making up stories to cover for reckless driving that had damaged the vehicle. After that, Sato had quietly asked around and discovered that he was far from the only driver who had experienced something similar. There was an unofficial understanding among the veteran night shift drivers that Tunnel 3 was to be avoided after midnight, that routes should be planned to use alternative passages, even if it meant adding time and distance to the trip. Sato said that the sightings had been happening for at least a decade, possibly longer, though no one seemed to know the origin of the phenomenon or who the girl was supposed to be. Some drivers claimed she was the ghost of a child who had been killed in a traffic accident in or near the tunnel. Others said she was the spirit of a girl who had gone missing years ago and whose body was supposedly hidden somewhere in the area. There were even theories that she wasn't a ghost at all, but some kind of urban manifestation, a collective hallucination or psychological phenomenon created by the stress and isolation of night driving. Sato didn't speculate on which explanation was correct. He only knew that the sightings were consistent enough that he took them seriously, and he advised Kenji to do the same. From that night forward, Sato said, he had never driven through Tunnel 3 after dark, and he had never seen the girl again. He suggested Kenji follow the same policy if he wanted to avoid another encounter. Kenji took the advice seriously, rerouting his trips to avoid Tunnel 3 whenever possible, even when it meant longer drives and smaller fares. His passengers occasionally questioned the route choices, and he would offer vague explanations about traffic or construction, never mentioning the real reason for his caution. For several months, he managed to avoid the tunnel entirely, and life returned to something resembling normal. The memory of that night began to fade, taking on the quality of a nightmare rather than a lived experience. Then, one night in early spring, he received a dispatch for a pickup in an area that was difficult to reach without using Tunnel 3. It was past 1 in the morning, and the fare was substantial enough that declining it would reflect poorly on his record. Kenji calculated alternate routes in his head, but they would add at least 20 minutes to the trip, and the customer had requested immediate pickup. He made the decision to accept the fare and use the tunnel, telling himself that what had happened before was a one-time anomaly, that lightning didn't strike twice, that he would be fine. He picked up his passenger, a young woman heading home after a late shift at a hospital, and they made pleasant conversation as he drove toward Shibuya. As they approached Tunnel 3, Kenji felt his anxiety spike, his palms sweating and his heart racing, but he forced himself to maintain a calm exterior. They entered the tunnel, and everything seemed normal at first. Just the usual concrete walls and fluorescent lights, and the steady hum of tires on pavement. Kenji kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. His passenger was talking about her shift, describing a difficult case she had dealt with, and Kenji made appropriate responses while internally counting down the meters until they would exit. They were 3/4 of the way through, when he felt a coldness settle over the car, the temperature dropping so suddenly that his breath became visible. His passenger stopped mid-sentence, and Kenji heard her intake of breath, sharp and startled. Against his better judgment, he glanced in the mirror. The girl was there, sitting directly behind him just as before, her eyeless face tilted toward him and her mouth moving in that same silent plea. "Take me home." But this time, his passenger could see her too. The young woman screamed, a sound of pure terror that filled the enclosed space of the car, and she scrambled away from the girl, pressing herself against the door. The pounding started immediately, both windows simultaneously, and Kenji pushed the accelerator to the floor, the car surging forward with dangerous speed. The girl's assault on the windows was more violent than before, the cracks spreading faster, and Kenji could see pieces of glass beginning to separate from the frames. They shot out of the tunnel, going well over the speed limit, and, as before, the moment they cleared the concrete walls, everything stopped. The cold vanished, replaced by the mild spring night, and the girl disappeared from the mirror. Kenji pulled over immediately, and his passenger jumped out of the car before it had fully stopped, stumbling onto the sidewalk and doubling over as if she might be sick. Kenji followed her out, his legs unsteady, and they stood together in silence for several minutes, both of them shaking and trying to catch their breath. The young woman finally looked at him and asked what that had been. Her, voice barely above a whisper. Kenji told her the truth, that he didn't know, that he had seen the same thing months earlier, that it was connected somehow to Tunnel 3, and that other drivers had experienced it too. The woman listened, her face pale, and then she made Kenji promise to report it, to tell someone official what was happening, because if drivers were experiencing this regularly, it was a safety hazard that needed to be addressed. Kenji agreed, though he suspected that any official report would be dismissed, just as his previous attempt had been. The following day, Kenji went to the police and filed a formal report, describing both incidents in detail and providing the names of other drivers who had experienced similar events. The officer who took his report was polite but clearly skeptical, noting down the information but making no promises about investigation or action. Kenji also contacted the company that maintained the tunnel, explaining the situation and requesting that they review their security footage from the nights in question. The response he received was bureaucratic and non-committal, thanking him for his concern and assuring him that the tunnel was regularly inspected and maintained to the highest safety standards. No one seemed willing to take his claims seriously, and Kenji realized that he was essentially on his own in dealing with this knowledge. He made the decision to stop driving nights entirely, switching to day shifts even though it meant a significant reduction in income. Several other drivers who had experienced encounters in Tunnel 3 made similar choices, and there was a quiet exodus of veteran night drivers from the company, men and women who had spent years navigating Tokyo's nocturnal streets, but who could no longer stomach the fear that came with certain routes. Kenji heard through the informal network of drivers that the sightings continued, that new drivers who didn't know to avoid the tunnel were encountering the girl and experiencing the same terrifying sequence of events, and that the company was struggling to retain night shift workers as word spread about the haunted passage beneath Shibuya. But nothing official ever came of it. No investigation, no closure, no explanation that would allow those who had seen her to make sense of their experience and move on. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.